Welcome to the Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. There are now more guns on the streets of America than people. A couple of weekends ago, in a 72-hour period, we had 475 shootings, resulting in 123 people dead. Just another weekend in 21st century America. Every time there's a mass shooting, the gun debate heats up, and then in a matter of days, it usually cools down. Even Newtown didn't make a difference. We look at guns and gun violence as a sui generis American problem, one built around the emotional tentpoles of freedom, the Second Amendment, and the polarization of political debate. But there is a bigger part of the iceberg that's below the surface, and that is the connection between guns on the street and drugs, cartels, gangs, and a force darker and more sinister than the NRA. We're going to talk about all of this today with my guest, Juan Grillo. He's a contributing writer at the New York Times, specializing in crime and drugs. He's based in Mexico City, and he's worked for Time Magazine, the History Channel, CNN, Reuters, and the Associated Press. He's the author of the books El Narco and Gangster Warlords, and his latest work is Blood, Gun, Money. It is my pleasure to welcome Juan Grillo to the Who, What, Why podcast. Juan, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here, yeah.
Why don't we talk more about drugs and gangs when we talk about the gun problem in America today?
I think when the gun problem comes up in the United States, and I speak as a Brit who's been living in Mexico for 20 years. So I'm a foreigner to the United States, but a country I do love and I've been reporting on quite intensely. I think when the United States looks at guns, it very hits to the emotions and to two core things dominate the discussion about guns. The first is the mass shootings, and that's obviously for an obvious reason when you have these things like from Columbine to Parkland to Las Vegas. They're such extraordinary traumatic events. This really, I think if you say guns, this is going to really dominate the discussion. This will really come up and be the thing dominating people's conversations. And the second is more the issue of guns, gun rights, the NRA, and these organizations that have been around for many years and the culture war around that. So I think these things are so strong and emotive that the issue of guns and crime, guns and drugs, it's overlooked. But in many ways, this is really the core issue, or one of the core issues about firearms. If we look at firearms deaths in the United States, the majority are carried out by people who have the guns illegally and often very, very connected to the drug trade. And then at a broader level, if we look at the guns coming down to Mexico, it's again linked massively to the cartels and illegal drug trade, and the guns also going to Central American countries like El Salvador, Honduras, with very high levels of homicides, and again linked to this. So I think these other very, very emotive issues make us overlook what is in some ways such a core issue in this discussion.
A core issue, and also the connection between the black market for guns that's driven by the gangs and the cartels and the way these guns get on the streets of America.
Yeah, absolutely. When I first, I've been investigating cartel violence for 20 years that I've been in Mexico. And this is my third book on organized crime. And I first wanted to kind of go into this issue of how guns are moving in the black market, looking very simply at the criminal issues and not looking at so much of the emotive politics. But I found it was impossible to do. I found that when you get into this and look at how laws are applied in the United States, how the laws play out, you have to get into the gun politics. And you have to get into the idea of why, for example, there's what we could describe, or what's been described as a private sale loophole, why the law doesn't apply for some sales, and that's abused by traffickers. Why it is that when a smoking gun is literally discovered at a crime scene, that people, when they're searching for it, when the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, is searching for it, they're not allowed to do a digital search. That's against the law. So when you see these kind of quite, crazy or surprising things in enforcement, this comes down to the gun politics. And the fact that you have, and it's, you have this legal industry selling guns and these companies producing these guns in factories, some in the United States, some over in Europe or further afield, and a huge amount of their product that is produced legally then goes to criminals, goes to drug dealers, and they're aware of this, but that's the way they do business.
What is the nexus then between the gangs, the cartels in Mexico, and guns on the streets of the U.S.?
So in Mexico, we've had this wave of violence over the last 2 decades, particularly the last 16, 17 years. And this has been driven by the fighting between these cartels, these major criminal organizations who are trafficking billions of dollars of drugs to the United States, but they're also involved in a whole bunch of other crimes. They've really diversified to a portfolio of activities, including wildcat mining, including human smuggling, sex trafficking, product piracy, oil theft, and all of these things. Now, this violence, has been extraordinary. It's been completely crazy. And you have had these things like these mass graves where there have been almost 300 corpses in the mass graves. You've had these many bad things happening. It's been essentially like an armed conflict. And we've seen this huge iron river of firearms flow from the United States, in the illegal market in the United States, to Mexico to supply these cartels. Now, this is indisputable. If you look at the ATF's official figures in the last 12 years, we get more than 160,000 firearms traced directly from criminals in Mexico, including some of the most violent cartels, to shops and factories in the United States. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, that's the guns that have been seized and effectively traced. But the estimates of the real numbers are more than 200,000 firearms every year. So the cartels here who are really causing this destruction to the point of destabilizing parts of this country are very, very linked to the criminal black market for guns in the United States.
Where do all these guns wind up? I mean, these numbers are so astronomical.
Yeah, I mean, you see in Mexico a huge amount of armed criminals. You see criminals, like every day we have these, new incidents emerge of like a convoy of 50 vehicles, full of guys with AR-15s, AK-47s driving through a town, like shootouts every day, more than 3,000 murders a month in this country. So, really, really incredible things, very, very sad things. And then because the guns are also going to the heavily armed groups, they're also going to some other people who are more like vigilantes trying to fight the cartels, are also getting guns. But also you get guns like filtering down the scale. So you get things like when the more serious criminals might use their gun in a crime to shoot a high-ranking police officer or a politician, and then dump that gun on the street, and they get resold. So you have school kids here with firearms, and incidents there, 13, 14-year-old kids with illegal firearms as well. So you get kind of really the cycle of violence is not only the organized crime being very bad, but that has a spillover effect of regular common crime being worse as well.
Given the scope of the problem, is it silly to assume that this conversation that takes place here in the U.S. about gun shows and sales and background checks, et cetera, that really can't even make a dent in the scope of the problem?
So what I found in my investigation is that for many years I saw this, like you're saying, as this is an intractable problem. But when I really got into investigating how this is happening, and one breakthrough interview for me was in 2017. I interviewed a gun trafficker in a prison in Mexico in Ciudad Juarez, and he explained the exact modus operandi that he was driving to the United States to Dallas to gun shows, and he was going back into Mexico every weekend with more than a dozen AR-15s. And when I saw this, I realized that there's been no even basic effort to stop these guns going to the criminals. And I'll give some examples. You have criminals walking into shops and buying 10 AK-47s, exactly identical AK-47s in a single model, and they're going to the cartels. So how is there not even a red light there if somebody's going in and buying 10 identical AK-47s? There's bigger sales. There's single sales where people have bought 85 firearms in a single sale. There's cases like one in Florida of a guy who bought 1,000 firearms and resold them to gun traffickers at gun shows, abusing this private sale loophole. Now, the private sale loophole is this idea that if you're just a private, regular person, just reselling an old gun you have in a collection, you don't need paperwork for it. But in this case, he was reselling more than 1,000 guns, and he was deliberately doing it to traffickers for profits. So these things are happening. Other examples of somebody, who's supposedly a housewife walking in and buying 10 50 caliber firearms, these big guns which fire bullets the size of small Coca-Cola bottles. They're used by the cartels to, have these ambushes against military and police. So these kind of things are happening. And I think there could be basic law enforcement to try and crack down on this that does not challenge the rights of Americans to have guns. It does not challenge the Second Amendment. It's simply saying we've got to try and enforce stopping guns being given so blatantly to criminals. Now, even if the idea is you're not going to stop this completely, there's still going to be cartels with guns. There's still many guns that are moving around. But reducing the number of firearms could have an effect. Right now we see the fact that any 15-year-old wannabe gangbanger here has got an AK-47. You see they're doing these ambushes. These are things that I'm covering, that I've been covering over many years. Or they'll ambush, it might be a police at a stoplight, and they'll just spray 500 bullets and kill the 5 cops, and also kill the guy driving behind, the other guy selling tacos on the side of the street, a child, a woman walking around with, the child, and they'll be hit. So all of this extra damage because the abundance of firearms is so much. And it just, for the record, for the historical record, doesn't, the fact is that you've had this violent, what I consider an armed conflict in Mexico, and some people consider a weird hybrid armed conflict in Mexico over the last decade and a half. And America is complicit in supplying the guns to this, and does it want that, as part of its, what its country is doing.
How much of the guns that find their way down in Mexico make their way back to the U.S. as part of this kind of iron river, as you call it?
There's some, but the majority, once they're down here, they stay down here. But there are some cases, in fact, when there's been some big spotlights on this, it's been in some of those cases. One example was the shooting of a border patrol agent from the BORTAC unit, Brian Terry, in December 2010. Now, that was a special case because that gun was traced to an ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, the gun police, an operation by them called Fast and Furious. And anybody who follows the issue will immediately want to know about Fast and Furious or bring that up. Fast and Furious was a botched operation by the ATF back under the Obama administration, where they attempted to have a big op to trace these guns and put up a conspiracy case. And they followed almost 2,000 firearms from gun sellers in Phoenix, Arizona. Many of them went over the border and they got lost. And one of them went with some group of criminals, and it came back up over the border by these criminals who crossed the border illegally. And they got in a firefight with BORTAC agents and shot dead Brian Terry. Became a very, very big case. So there are some high-profile cases like that, but the majority of them stay down here. But these same issues very much affect the United States. If you look at the firearms deaths in Baltimore, suffering very high number of deaths. If you look at firearms deaths in New York and Washington, which had gone down, which are now seeing surges for various reasons, but you still have these big firearms trafficking, these same techniques. And as part of my book, Blood, Gun, Money, I did go and talk to firearms trafficker in Baltimore, Maryland. I talked to another firearms guy who's involved in it over in New England, a guy called Billy Jack Curtis working for a group who'd been in the prison gang and also come out and work for us. So you see many of these networks very, very similar in the United States and affecting the deaths in the United States.
To what extent can we begin to deal with the gun issue by dealing with the drug issue?
Well, these things are entwined, and I think one of the reasons on these issues, drugs and guns, that have been, drug and gun deaths in the inner cities of the United States, deaths here in Mexico. We do need to have comprehensive approaches to these. Try and get politics. I mean, one of the reasons, the failures of kind of modern government in some of these areas, that everything's isolated. So you have kind of the drug czar, and then you have the ATF, and then you have kind of immigration issues, and you actually realize that all of these are very, very connected. I mean, part of the issues of refugees at the southern border, they're running from gun violence. This gun violence is linked to the gun and drugs politics in the United States. You see these things looping around. But I think if we're trying to have a comprehensive approach, and I think it begins with an idea of harm reduction. I mean that's a philosophy. Back in 1971, when President Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs, he declared drugs the public enemy number one of the United States, and he spoke of the abolition of drugs from American life. He said, there would be no drugs in American life. This heroin would not be a problem. We do see now, 50 years after that, we see record overdose deaths in the United States. It's obviously failed. So I think we have to look at the idea of harm reduction. How do we reduce the harm from the bad effects of drugs? How we reduce the harm from the money going into the illegal drug trade? And the same with guns. How do you reduce the harm of criminals getting guns who want to commit murder and so forth? To try to kind of build a more comprehensive solution to this, and I think it means in terms of guns, universal background checks, which is supported by 89% of Americans and 81% of gun owners themselves, trying to crack down on what they call the straw purchasers, who are people who are paid by criminals to go into a shop and buy guns, knowing that these are guns going to cartels, to gangs, to criminals. They know that. They go into the shops, they're buying guns, and the recommended punishment for that now is probation. That's even when these guns are used in crimes, often killing innocent women and children south of the border or in cities like Baltimore. So clamping down that enforcement, again, for harm reduction of the bad violence using guns, and with drugs, harm reduction there. So I think the marijuana debate has now been won basically in the public sphere, but we still have right now, and as we speak, we still have money being used to buy illegal marijuana, and that's supplying gangs, supplying cartels, being used to buy guns. So try and get that money out of that now from marijuana. Then when we get to harder drugs, it's a difficult discussion, but it can start off with the idea of we really have to treat addicts. And according to the American Medical Association, 90% of the addicts in the United States who need treatment are not getting the treatment. At the beginning, there's a lot of things to move there. We're simply trying to treat addicts and offer them treatment to try. And these addicts spend a lot of money on drugs, which is then used by these dealers who are buying guns, by cartels buying guns, and feeding back into this kind of negative circle of violence.
Why are we seeing surges now?
I believe that the rise of gun homicides in the United States, like late last year and early this year, there's various reasons, and you look at these reasons of gun violence going up and down over the years. I do believe that the protests against the police and a loss of confidence in the police are a factor in this. And we have to get through some difficult conditions in the cities, but it seems hard that they couldn't be a factor in this when we've seen clear rises of violence in many cities. But there are other factors as well with the continued large illegal drug market, people making money off that, the illegal black market in firearms, supplying people. We have seen as well, with an effect of the lockdown and the pandemic, an increase in drug overdose deaths. So we've actually seen a kind of negative effect, a lot of despair, a lot of depression. And this gets into very polarizing issues in the United States. But there are some hard truths and some hard realities there to look at in terms of the violence.
Where do the gun manufacturers fall into this equation?
Well, it's interesting. I looked at the gun industry, and I talked to some people in the legal gun industry. And went to a couple of gun factories and looking at the things, people at different stages of this. And on one side, I see, there's one example. This is actually with a gun broker over in Eastern Europe who was selling AK-47 for various things. It was a very interesting example, though, I think, of a lot of the mentality. And I asked him, he was selling guns to Saudi Arabia, to various governments in Africa, to Iraq, and so forth. And I asked him if he was concerned about the guns that he sold ended up with the Islamic State. And there's these various, ways that guns are sold legally to governments and then get leaked and end up with the Islamic State. And he said he wasn't worried because if he was obeying the law, if the sales he was doing was certified, he was protected. And I said, I'll repeat the question. I know you're protected legally, but are you concerned ethically if the guns you sell end up with people who are committing murders? And he looked at me for a second and he just said, no. And I think it was a very, it was a blunt answer, but it was also very telling, I think very truthful and honest about what a lot of the people in the industry think. If you ask somebody who's involved in a gun manufacturing, if they say, how do you feel if your guns end up down with cartels in Mexico, with dealers on the corner of Baltimore? And they might say, well, legally, I'm protected because I sold it legally to a gun seller, and then somebody bought it through, it wasn't my fault. But ethically, are you worried? I said, well, no, because I'm protected. So I think that kind of sums up a lot of this. How you solve that, it's difficult. I don't think you're going to get people to really grow a conscience. I think it's about, or at least maybe persuading them, there's some people in the gun industry to enforce these things. Now, there is, I think, a mixed feeling in the gun industry itself about some of this. Some of them, you see people who are not concerned about profits, but some of them are more concerned, and it is probably a smaller percentage of the guns. But you also have this pressure from some of the hard end of the guns rights movement, the kind of, in a way, what I call the Second Amendment fundamentalists, who have this such kind of fundamentalist idea that the Second Amendment cannot be infringed on at all, and any kind of regulation is an attack and is part of a cycle of trying to, grab the guns, get the guns off, that they really attack you see examples where they attacked companies that try to support, things like smart guns, which are guns that only respond to a gun. They try to attack these measures. So I think that comes to it as well. But right now there is a huge window of opportunity. You have the majority, with the tie-breaking vote of the vice president, the majority in the Senate. You've got the big popular support looking for some measures. So there's certainly why is the universal background check? Why is that not being passed yesterday? Why is that? Why are we still waiting on that? And that's a question, the big question to ask. There is measures that can be taken right now.
What is the attitude towards this proliferation of guns in Mexico? What is the public policy position and attitude about all of this there?
So, historically, about 10 years ago, you had the president of Mexico then, Felipe Calderon, started taking a stronger position of there's got to be something done about this. Why is the U.S. not acting? Then you had the Fast and Furious scandal in 2011 that broke into the public sphere. And after that, this kind of issue was left for the last decade. And in that time, we saw a huge amount of guns pouring south. Now we have seen the current government also taking this issue, particularly the foreign secretary called Marcelo Ebrard. He's now taken up this issue, and they are now, lobbying on this issue again. And I think among many of the informed public in Mexico, they will immediately point out this issue where all the guns are coming from the United States. This is a big problem, and it is something. But there's also other people who the violence in Mexico is complicated. There was one woman I interviewed, a very, very tragic story of her son being disappeared, meaning forcibly taken by an armed group, and then they couldn't find him for many years until eventually she located his body in a mass grave. And I asked her, do you feel bitter towards the United States that the guns were all coming from there? And she said, well, I feel more bitter towards my own government here in Mexico. They're the ones who failed to protect me. So there's mixed feelings. There's a lot of, long-term disillusionment with the system here in Mexico, and there has been a basic failure of public security here. But there are plenty of people as well saying, well, what about the United States and these guns coming down from the U.S.? So it's certainly an issue on the agenda here, and certainly many people are very aware of this.
What do you see as the future of this? How do you see this playing out?
I want to be optimistic and say there are things that can be done, and we can confront these problems. Then also be realistic about this kind of broken, I see it in some ways as a broken political time we live in, where a lot of problems are not solved, and I see politics as being quite broken in many countries. Eventually, in the long term, I think this has to be resolved. I think this is, what I've been covering the last 20 years in Latin America, and say in Mexico, in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Colombia, Brazil, Venezuela, a very historic moment of violence, and really pretty crazy violence. In this 20 years, there have been more than 2 million homicides in this region. This has been worse violence in the Middle East. The Middle East has been a lot of place where there's been focus on, but really been more bodies piled up here. And I think this is a historic time of violence that has to end at some point. I think there has to be some resolution to these things of guns, policing, drugs, and these interrelated issues. But I think it will take time. However, trying to put forward, trying to take a more conscientious role about this and trying to understand this better could make that ending be sooner rather than later.
Juan Grillo, his book is Blood, Gun, Money, How America Arms Gangs and Cartels. Juan, I thank you so much for spending time with us.